Across England, they still stand, castles, fortresses, and towers of stone, built to endure centuries, and to make sure people remembered who held power. We are often told these places were homes of kings, symbols of protection, and monuments of medieval strength. But for thousands of others, they were places of silence. Behind these walls, people were imprisoned without trial, interrogated without records, and in many cases, they simply vanished. No grave, no name, no explanation. History rarely tells us what truly happened inside these walls, but the stone remembers. Tonight, we are not looking for ghosts. We are looking for evidence. Why were these fortresses designed the way they were? What purpose did the dungeons truly serve? And why do so many of these places still carry legends of curses and unease? This is not a story of myth. It is a story of power, fear, and what happens when history chooses not to speak. Across medieval England, castles did not rise by accident. They were not placed where the view was beautiful, nor where life was comfortable. They were built where they could be seen, on hills, beside rivers, above villages, along roads where trade and movement could be watched and controlled. From the beginning, the castle was less a residence and more a statement. After the Norman conquest of 1066, England changed not only politically, but physically. William of Normandy understood something essential. Winning a battle was not enough. To rule England, power had to be permanent. Stone made power permanent. Castles became that presence. They rose above the landscape as constant reminders that authority had arrived, and that it was not leaving. Despite modern imagination, medieval castles were deeply uncomfortable places to live. Thick stone walls trapped cold and damp. Windows were narrow slits, designed to stop arrows, not to let light in. Fireplaces struggled against winter. Privacy barely existed. Even nobles often preferred manor houses when peace allowed. The castle was not built for comfort, it was built for control. Its design followed a simple psychological logic. Height dominated the viewer. Walls denied access. Gates narrowed movement. Drawbridges forced hesitation. Every feature sent the same message. Entry was conditional. Permission could be withdrawn. You were not meant to feel welcome. You were meant to feel small. Inside the walls, space was carefully divided. The Great Hall projected authority and order, but beneath it, often below ground level, were spaces never meant to be seen. Nearly every major castle developed places of confinement, dark, cold, airless, disorienting. These spaces did not require instruments of torture to break people. Time did that. Cold did that. Uncertainty did that. Castles did not exist in isolation. Each one dominated a surrounding population. Villages lived within sight of the walls. Farmers worked land, knowing who watched from above. Even without violence, the structure itself enforced obedience. This is why castles appear repeatedly in records of rebellion and suppression. When uprisings failed, leaders were not simply executed, they were imprisoned, often publicly, within the very walls meant to project order. The message was unmistakable. Resistance ended here. Memory ended here. Over time, castles accumulated stories. Some were documented, many were not. Records were written by those in power. Names of kings survived. Names of prisoners often did not. Yet the physical spaces remained unchanged. Worn steps from repeated descent. Iron rings set into stone. Doors reinforced where they were never meant to open quickly. What we call medieval castles today are often romanticized ruins, tourist attractions, wedding venues, but their original purpose was neither romantic nor decorative. They were machines of authority. They controlled land, movement, and fear with equal precision. And once we understand this, one question becomes unavoidable. If castles were designed to control the living, what were their deepest spaces designed to do to those who disappeared inside them? That question leads us to the most infamous fortress of them all, the Tower of London. The Tower of London was never just a castle. From the moment it was built, it served a different purpose, not simply to defend the city, but to dominate it, Rising beside the River Thames, the tower stood where everyone entering London could see it: merchants, nobles, foreign visitors. Before they reached the city, they reached the tower, and the message was unmistakable. This was where royal authority lived. Built by William the Conqueror in the late 11th century, the tower became the most powerful symbol of Norman rule. But its reputation was not shaped by battles or sieges. It was shaped by silence. For centuries, the tower functioned as a prison for those considered dangerous to the crown, not common criminals, but queens, princes, nobles, and political rivals, people whose very existence posed a threat. Imprisonment in the tower was rarely public. There were no crowds, no trials held in the open. Many prisoners entered quietly and were never seen again. Some were executed, but even execution at the tower followed its own rules. High-status prisoners were often killed within the walls, away from the public gaze. Their deaths were controlled, contained, and recorded only as much as necessary. Others were simply held. Weeks turned into months, months into years. Records faded, names disappeared. The most famous case remains unresolved to this day. In 1483, two boys were brought into the tower: Edward V, the uncrowned King of England, and his younger brother Richard. They were last seen playing within these walls. Then they vanished. No trial, no official death record, no contemporary explanation. Centuries later, historians still debate what happened, but the tower itself offers no answers, only questions. This uncertainty is not unique. The tower was designed to control information as much as people. What happened inside was rarely meant to be known outside. Even the architecture reflects this: multiple layers of walls, restricted inner spaces, rooms without windows, passages that lead nowhere. The deeper one moves into the tower, the less history speaks. Today, the Tower of London is a museum, a heritage site, a place of ceremony and tourism. But beneath the polished surfaces, the stone remains unchanged. It still carries the weight of those who entered without certainty and left without record. The tower was not built to remember the dead. It was built to erase them, and it stands as a warning of what happens when power decides who is allowed to be remembered. Warwick Castle was never meant to be silent. From its earliest days, it was a fortress built for conflict. Positioned on a bend of the River Avon, Warwick controlled movement through the heart of England. Armies passed near its walls. Trade routes curved around its towers. And for centuries, war was never far away. Unlike the Tower of London, Warwick's power was not defined by secrecy. It was defined by presence. Banners on the battlements, soldiers on the walls, and constant readiness for siege. Warwick was a military machine. Its fortifications evolved without pause. Walls thickened, towers multiplied, defenses adapted to new weapons and new enemies. The castle did not rest, because the country around it rarely did. At the center of its history stands one figure: Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known to history as the Kingmaker. He did not rule England himself, but he decided who did. From Warwick, armies were raised, kings were supported, then overthrown. Power shifted not through law, but through force and timing. During the Wars of the Roses, Warwick Castle became a nerve center of civil war, not a refuge, but a headquarters. Decisions made here sent men to fight, and often to die. And when battles ended, the castle did not soften. Prisoners were held, rebels were confined, the defeated were kept close, under watch. Warwick reminds us that castles were not only places of imprisonment or mystery, they were engines of action. They produced violence, not just contained it. Yet even here, beneath the noise of war, the same pattern emerges. Those who lost were rarely remembered. Their names faded. Their stories ended behind stone walls. Warwick Castle never rested, because England never rested. And in its constant readiness for conflict, it reveals the truth of medieval power. Before justice disappeared into the dungeon below, it was decided in places like Warwick, where strength mattered more than law. Justice, in medieval England, was not blind. It was visible, public, and often designed to be feared. But beneath castles and fortresses, another system existed, hidden from crowds, hidden from records, hidden from mercy. The dungeon was not a courtroom. It was not a place to determine truth. It was a place to remove people from the world. Most medieval dungeons were never designed for long-term imprisonment. They were improvised spaces, cellars, storage chambers, rooms below ground where light rarely reached. What mattered was not legality, but isolation. Prisoners were held without clear sentences. Days were not counted. Seasons passed unnoticed. The absence of time became its own punishment. Contrary to popular belief, physical torture was not always necessary. Darkness disoriented. Cold weakened the body. Silence eroded the mind. For many, the dungeon was not a step toward execution or release. It was a pause, indefinite, and often fatal. Those who survived rarely left records. Those who died rarely received graves. The dungeon erased people quietly, efficiently, and without witnesses. In some cases, instruments of torture were used, not to uncover truth, but to enforce obedience. Confessions mattered less than compliance. Pain was a language power understood well. Yet even here, records are fragmented. Names appear once, then vanish. Charges are listed, outcomes are not. Justice, as history records it, ends at the dungeon door. Today, these spaces are preserved as exhibits. Visitors walk through them in minutes. But for those once held here, minutes stretched into years. The dungeon was never meant to be remembered. It was meant to be forgotten. And in forgetting, it reveals its true purpose. Not justice, not law, but control. When justice disappears, stories take its place. Across medieval England, castles and fortresses began to acquire reputations, not written into law, not recorded in official documents, but passed quietly from one generation to the next. These places became known as cursed, haunted, unsettling. Yet these legends did not emerge from imagination alone. They formed where history left gaps. Where records stopped, where names vanished, where deaths went unaccounted for, when people disappeared into dungeons without trial or explanation. Communities were left with questions that power never answered. And unanswered questions do not disappear, they transform. Over time, memory became story, story became legend, and legend became warning, a shadow on the wall, footsteps where no one walked, a presence that could not be named. These were not simply tales of ghosts, they were attempts to explain injustice without language for it, to give form to fear when the truth was inaccessible. Castles like the Tower of London, Warwick, and countless lesser fortresses across England share this pattern. Where authority was absolute, memory became fragile. And when memory fractured, myth filled the space. Curses often followed moments of betrayal. Executions carried out in silence. Imprisonments without return. The stories served a purpose. They warned future generations. They reminded listeners that something had gone wrong here. Even today, visitors speak of unease, not because they believe in the supernatural, but because the spaces themselves carry weight. Stone absorbs experience. Walls witness repetition. Silence accumulates. Modern psychology has a name for this: collective memory. Trauma passed through place rather than people. The medieval world lacked that language, so it spoke in legends instead. In this way, curses are not evidence of superstition. They are evidence of unresolved history. They tell us where justice failed, where power acted without accountability, and where the past was never properly acknowledged. The walls do not whisper because they are haunted. They feel heavy because they remember. And as long as these places stand, they will continue to ask the same question: what happens when power moves on, but memory does not? By the late Middle Ages, fear had acquired a reputation of its own. Walk through any former dungeon today, and the story seems obvious: iron devices, spiked chambers, instruments designed to destroy the human body. But the reality of medieval torture is more restrained, and in many ways, more unsettling. Contrary to popular belief, torture was not routine. It was regulated, rarely legal without authorization, and often reserved for very specific purposes. The goal was not punishment, it was confession. Instruments such as the rack did exist. It stretched the body slowly, deliberately, until pain overwhelmed resistance, not to discover truth, but to produce compliance. Other devices, often associated with medieval cruelty, occupy a different category. The Iron Maiden, for example, appears frequently in museums and illustrations, yet there is little evidence it was used in the Middle Ages as commonly believed. Its popularity belongs more to later centuries, when history itself became theatre. This distinction matters, because the most effective methods rarely required machinery at all. Darkness disoriented the mind, cold weakened the body, isolation dissolved identity. These techniques left no visible scars, and therefore no reliable records. What survives in history is not a catalogue of suffering, but a collection of symbols, objects displayed to warn, spaces designed to intimidate, stories exaggerated to reinforce authority. Torture chambers, as we imagine them today, were not designed for constant use. They were designed to exist. Their presence alone was enough. To know such a place existed beneath the castle was often sufficient to secure obedience above ground. And this is where myth and reality begin to overlap. Legends amplified fear, fear reinforced power, and power required fewer demonstrations of force. The truth is quieter than the stories suggest, but it is no less disturbing, because it reveals a system that did not rely on spectacle, but on the careful management of terror. And once fear becomes predictable, it becomes controllable. When we imagine medieval prisoners, we often picture criminals, thieves, murderers, the dangerous and the violent. But in England's great castles and fortresses, many prisoners were guilty of nothing at all. They were imprisoned not for what they had done, but for who they were. Queens were among them, women whose marriages had become politically inconvenient. Anne Boleyn was held in the Tower of London not as a criminal, but as a problem to be resolved. Others were confined for being related to the wrong person, born into the wrong bloodline, or standing too close to contested power. Nobles and aristocrats filled these prisons in times of instability. During civil wars and succession crises, loyalty itself became a crime. Some prisoners were held for years without formal charges. Others were never accused of anything at all. Their imprisonment was preventative, not punitive. They were removed from public view to reduce risk, silence opposition, or simply buy time. Children were not exempt. Young heirs were confined for their potential, not their actions. Their very existence threatened those who ruled in their name. Many disappeared quietly, leaving no trial records, no execution orders, and no graves. There were also prisoners whose offense was knowledge, messengers, witnesses, officials who knew too much, or asked the wrong questions. For these individuals, imprisonment was not a step toward justice, it was a solution. What unites these prisoners is not guilt, but inconvenience. They were inconvenient to power. Castles and fortresses offered the perfect answer: secure, legitimate-looking, removed from scrutiny, behind stone walls. People could be held indefinitely, without explanation, without resolution. And history often accepted this silence. Records mention their arrival, but not their release. Their names appear once, then vanish. These were not forgotten people. They were deliberately erased. Understanding who was imprisoned forces us to reconsider what medieval prisons truly were. They were not primarily instruments of justice, they were instruments of control. And when power decides who must disappear, law becomes secondary. In the next part of this series, we will examine how castles themselves were designed to make this control possible, not just physically, but psychologically, because the most powerful prisons are not the ones that restrain the body, but the ones that break the mind. Power does not always need force. Sometimes, space is enough. Medieval castles were not only built to stop armies, they were built to shape behavior, to intimidate, to remind those inside that resistance was pointless. Everything about these structures worked on the mind: the height of the walls, the narrowness of corridors, the weight of stone overhead. These were not accidents of medieval engineering, they were deliberate choices. To enter a castle was to be diminished, doors narrowed, ceilings lowered, light faded. Movement was controlled at every stage. You were guided, redirected, delayed, rarely allowed to see far ahead, never allowed to feel oriented. This disorientation was psychological, not physical. It created dependence, confusion, and submission. For prisoners, this effect was magnified. Cells were placed deep within the structure. Sound was absorbed by stone. Time became impossible to measure. Even those not imprisoned felt it. Visitors waited in courtyards, surrounded by walls that offered no horizon. Messengers stood beneath towers that made them feel small. Authority did not need to speak. The building spoke first. Castles separated people from the outside world, not only physically, but mentally. Once inside, the rhythm of normal life disappeared. No familiar sounds, no predictable light, no sense of direction. This environment weakens certainty. Uncertainty is the foundation of resistance. Modern psychology recognizes this effect. Sensory deprivation, loss of spatial control, architectural dominance. The medieval world had no such terms, but it understood the result. The castle was a message. It told you who was in control. It told you how small you were. And it told you that escape, even in thought, was unlikely. This is why castles remained effective long after battles ended. They did not rely on violence alone. They relied on expectation. People behaved differently inside them. They spoke more carefully. They waited more obediently. They accepted delay, silence, and uncertainty. The most powerful prisons are not defined by chains. They are defined by space. And medieval castles mastered this lesson centuries before psychology gave it a name. In the next part of this series, we will turn to what history failed to record: the missing documents. The silence is left on the page because power does not only control space, it controls what is allowed to be written down. History feels solid because it is written down: dates, names, official records that give the impression of certainty. But medieval power understood something fundamental. What is not recorded can be as powerful as what is. Castles, prisons, and courts generated paperwork, orders, accounts, inventories. Yet when it comes to imprisonment, disappearance, and death, the records often fall silent. Prisoners appear suddenly in documents. A name listed, a transfer noted, an expense recorded for food or guards. Then, nothing. No release, no execution order, no burial entry. This silence was not always accidental. Many medieval records were created for administration, not truth. They existed to justify authority, to track resources, and to protect those in power. Recording the outcome of imprisonment was often unnecessary. Sometimes undesirable. To document a death required explanation. To explain required accountability. Silence avoided both. Some records were deliberately vague. Others were destroyed. Many were never written at all. Illiteracy was common. Paper was expensive. And memory was controlled by those who held office. Even when records survive, they are selective. Women appear less frequently than men. Children are often unnamed. Lower status individuals vanish entirely. The result is a historical landscape filled with gaps. These gaps are not empty. They are shaped. They point to moments where power chose not to remember. Modern historians work against this silence. They compare fragments, cross-reference accounts, read what is implied rather than stated. But certainty remains elusive. What we often call mystery is simply absence. And absence, in medieval England, was frequently intentional. This forces a difficult conclusion. Our understanding of castles, prisons, and punishment is based not on complete evidence, but on what power allowed to survive. The walls endured. The records did not. And as long as history relies on documents created by authority, there will always be stories we cannot fully recover. In the final part of this series, we will step back from the Middle Ages and ask a broader question. Why do these places still matter to us today? What is it about stone, power, and silence that continues to resonate? Because when power outlives those it controlled, only the structures remain, and they remember what the records chose to forget. Power rarely announces its end. Kings die. Dynasties fall. Laws are rewritten, but stone remains. Across England, medieval castles still dominate the landscape, not as seats of authority, but as reminders of how authority once worked. These walls no longer imprison anyone. They no longer decide who lives, who disappears, or whose name is recorded. And yet, they still affect us. People lower their voices when they enter. They move more slowly. They listen, not because they believe in ghosts, but because space remembers something language struggles to explain. Castles were places where power was absolute, where justice could be suspended, where silence replaced accountability. What we have explored in this series is not simply medieval cruelty, but medieval systems that understood fear, that managed obedience, that controlled memory. Those systems did not vanish with the Middle Ages. They changed form. Today, power is less visible, less monumental, but it still decides what is recorded, what is forgotten, and who is heard. The difference is scale, not principle. When we walk through castles today, we are not visiting ruins. We are visiting blueprints. Blueprints of how authority uses space, architecture, and silence to shape behavior. The walls do not accuse. They do not absolve. They simply endure. And entrance is power's final advantage. History cannot give voice to everyone who was silenced behind these stones. The records are incomplete. The names are gone, but the structures remain, asking the same quiet question of every generation. What happens when power moves on, but its methods remain? The Middle Ages did not invent control. They refined it. And as long as these castles stand, they remind us that power does not need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes, it only needs to last longer than the people it controls.